All right, it's all yours now, Fred, if you want to introduce.
Oh, okay, great. Let me be very brief. Mark Woodbury-Smith is a Cambridge graduate who spent time at Yale as well, doing a postdoc, and then he moved to Canada for a while, and he's now back at University of Newcastle on time. He is a real leader in aspects of the forensics, the legal aspects of autism and Asperger's and related disorders. And he's going to be talking to us today about the risk of young people with autism being involved in extremist groups. This is sadly a real problem, and I have seen it happen in any number of ways, shapes, and forms. So I'm looking forward to his talk. Mark, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. I hope you can see my slides okay and hear me. So I'm going to talk about the interface between extremist groups and extremism and youth and adults with autism. Let me just move something so I can see my slides. There we go. So here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about in relation to vulnerability to extremism. I'll try and clarify the concept of extremism. I think one of the difficulties in this area is there is lack of clarity around concepts such as extremism, terrorism, violence, mass violence, and so forth. So I'll start with a degree of clarification. I'll talk about vulnerabilities to extremist activities from a mental health perspective, and I will discuss this point in relation to what literature there is that is available and the limitations of some of that literature. And then I'll talk about this issue with specific reference to autism. Now, from the outset, I just want to make it clear that I'm not claiming there's an association between autism and risk of extremist activities. But the point I really would like to make is that as a population, people with autism are vulnerable to engagement in particular groups, such as online groups, and they're vulnerable to getting drawn into these groups. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why that might be. I'll talk about some of the issues in relation to the assessment and then management and risk reduction. So I'll cover a lot, and I'll try and go into these issues in as much detail as I can in the time available, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So in terms of extremism, the concept of what it is, this is my own definition of extremism, but essentially I think this is a widely held definition of extremism and what it is. And there's three main elements to this form of extremism that I'm talking about. So there's holding beliefs with conviction, which in and of itself is probably okay, because I think we all hold beliefs with conviction. There's also the element of hate and anger towards others. So these may be others that don't hold similar beliefs, outgroups, and others that are deemed to be, for want of a better word, bad as a result of not sharing these beliefs. And then associated with this is the normalization of a violent solution as the only option. So there's those three elements of holding beliefs with conviction, this inherent anger or hate towards others that don't share these beliefs, and then the normalization of this violent solution as the only option. So why is this important in relation to autism? So I think it's fair to say that although we are aware of extremist acts that the media has described, and in a number of instances, the individuals involved have an established diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, I think it's fair to say that what's most important about this is not the fact that there is an association or that we're exploring the risk from a nature of association, but the fact that people with autism may be vulnerable to being recruited by extremist others. and that this vulnerability may be a reflection of the individual's social exclusion or otherwise marginalization. And that's important for us to know about, because we can do something about that. There may be an element of untreated mental health comorbidity, such as depression or anxiety. And again, that's important because we can do something about that. It also foregrounds this need, once you've identified this risk and you've identified this vulnerability, it foregrounds this need to develop support and services to protect vulnerable individuals if such support is not available. And I think in a lot of cases, it's not available, and that's a major issue. The other important point about this is clearly that extremism has a major impact on society at large, and that by studying risk in particular groups, such as those with mental health problems or those that have autism, we may be able to understand risk in the wider population. I guess another point about the importance of exploring this is autism is now an extremely common disorder. So this is a busy slide, and I'll just summarize the most important points. I draw your attention to the table on the right-hand side there. These are data from the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network across 11 sites across years from 2000 to 2014, basically measuring prevalence in 8-year-old children. So if you look at 2014, the prevalence is 1.68% essentially, which is 1 in 59 children. And you compare that with what the rates were in 2000, you'll see that there's been a huge leap in the number of cases diagnosed. The figure for 2018 is 23 per 1,000 children, 2.3%, or 1 in 44 children. And it's unclear what's going to happen to the trajectory from this point on. So the fact that autism is being commonly diagnosed now means that there are potentially individuals who are vulnerable to the type of behaviors that I'm talking about today. And then very briefly, just to draw your attention to the graphs on the left-hand side there. In the top, these are data for prevalence change across time from 1996 to 2010, and you'll see the red line, which is the prevalence of autism increasing. But if you look at the bottom graph and you look at the red and the green lines, the green line is autism with intellectual disability, the red line is autism without intellectual disability. You can see that a lot of the increase is coming from individuals who don't have a comorbid intellectual disability. And these are individuals that can easily slip through the net, that can be denied access to services, for example. So in terms of the data in relation to mental illness, first of all, and then we'll talk more specifically about autism. There have been a number of not terribly well conducted studies, but nonetheless, these are what we have in terms of the scientific literature. And these are studies that have been published in respected journals. So we can have some degree of certainty that they were conducted with appropriate methodologies. And here is one such study published in 2021 that basically looked at, it's like a systematic review, I suppose. It's collected all of the studies that describe particular terrorist groups, including lone actor terrorists and extremist groups, and looked at diagnostic information in relation to mental health problems. And you'll see in this table, which is again a busy table, and it's here purely for your information, and it's something that you can look at your leisure. But in this table, you'll see that the methodologies in terms of measurement and source of data vary from study to study. And therefore, it's unsurprising that if you look at the final column there in terms of the prevalence of any mental health disorder, any mental disorder or mental illness, the figures vary quite significantly from 0% up to, I believe, 57%. Yeah, there's a study there that's 57%. So there's quite a significant heterogeneity between studies in terms of prevalence estimates, and the likely source of that heterogeneity is, of course, the methodologies used, including the target population. I guess the best target population would be, for example, those who have a confirmed diagnosis rather than those who, in inverted commas, have indications of having mental illness. And if you just look at those with confirmed diagnoses, the mean prevalence is around about 15%. And then if you look at those that actually involved some form of clinical examination, the prevalence goes up to, the median prevalence, sorry, goes up to around 30 to 35%. I think the takeaway message from this is, well, probably two takeaway messages. One is that we need new methodologies, and the other is that actually the risk of having a mental health problem seems to be quite high in those that have engaged in far-right and other terrorist activities. In terms of specific mental disorders, though, whether, for example, depression or anxiety or schizophrenia or OCD and so forth are related to the risk, there isn't a huge amount of data that clarifies that. I've chosen one study here, partly because it wasn't included in that systematic review that I just showed you, but partly because it's a reasonably well conducted study of 600 or more adults from the community, from 3 communities in the UK, who were basically surveyed in relation to sympathies with right-wing organizations. And what they found in this study, again, I won't go into it in a huge amount of detail. The takeaway message from this really is that depression, particularly depression on a background of dysthymia or chronic low-grade, low mood, and anxiety symptoms, not necessarily an anxiety disorder as such, but having anxiety symptoms, are both independently associated with the risk of being sympathetic with violent protest and with terrorism. Now, this study also measured autism traits and found no relationship between those with autism traits who were sympathetic of violent protest and those with autism traits who condemned violent protest. But none of the individuals included in this study were autistic. And I think that was just a corollary investigation. The researchers whose names are listed here don't have a background in neurodevelopmental research, for example, and they were more interested in adult mental health risk in relation to being sympathetic with violent protest and extremist activity. Here's another example of a study that has looked at particular mental disorders in relation to the risk of violent extremism. Now, what you'll see here, so recall that in the last study, I mentioned that depression was associated with the risk of sympathy with violent extremism. Here, depression is less common among the at-risk groups. And in this case, it's lone actor terrorists versus the general population. You'll see that in around about the middle of this this figure, this bar chart, where you can see where it says depression, the orangey line is not as tall as the general population greenish line. There's a couple of lines where the at-risk prevalence is higher than in the population. One you'll see is schizophrenia, and the other you'll see is autism spectrum disorder. In relation to schizophrenia, this increased prevalence seems quite substantial. And what I don't know is whether a diagnosis of schizophrenia as conceptualized by the authors of this paper actually captured other psychotic type symptoms, including persecutory ideation, suspiciousness, and so forth. In relation to autism spectrum disorder, the prevalence was 3.3%, which is quite striking. Again, this is another study that has methodological limitations. These aren't people that have been directly assessed for whether or not they have autism. These are questionnaire-based, often online questionnaire-based methods. To be fair, though, the authors of this particular paper highlight the need to be careful regarding such factors as directly assessing individuals and picking the correct frame of reference in terms of the identification of people, and also not jumping to conclusions about figures here and what the risk might look like in the community at large, which is likely to be very different. So summarizing all that mental health literature, I think it's fair to say that the prevalence figures are heterogeneous across studies. I think it's also fair to say that we can probably estimate that between 10 and 20% of people with, 10 or 20% of those identified as extremist, including lone wolf, including people that have actually engaged in extremist activities of mass violence, have a mental health problem, but no particular diagnosis seems to stand out. I've not talked about personality and personality disorders. This is a much more difficult area to get information about, because I think most of those individuals that are included in studies or that information is obtained about probably have particular personality vulnerabilities, including psychopathy and narcissism and so forth. But whether they actually have a personality disorder is not entirely clear. And personality disorders are really quite difficult to diagnose. And then the last point here in terms of extracting information from that literature that I've presented shows that these studies raise the risk of violent extremism in autism spectrum disorder. Now, in terms of the forensic literature on autism, before I talk about extremism specifically, the idea that some people with autism have a risk of coming into contact with the criminal justice system goes back a long way. The literature spans more than 30 years, mostly comprising single case studies, sometimes larger case series, but generally plagued by some of the methodological limitations that I've mentioned already. And I think the significance of this forensic literature in terms of being able to come to conclusions about what the literature, what these 30 years of literature tell us, is that this is not about the frequency of unlawful behavior among autistic people, but simply the fact that some people with autism may engage in problematic behavior and illegal behavior, and that the engagement may in some way relate to their underlying autism. And there are examples in the literature of people who have come into contact with the criminal justice system in the context of pursuit of an interest, or in relation to social and emotional vulnerabilities, and in relation to comorbidities. So the point here is not the frequency of this apparent association, but the fact that when it does occur, the autism itself may be relevant in terms of understanding what went wrong and understanding what then needs to be done to support such individuals, and of course, understanding what needs to be done to prevent things like this happening. It's also important to point out that on the whole, if you look at this 30 years of literature, the behavior described is generally of a non-severe nature. There are clearly high-profile cases. We know about those high-profile cases, and I'm going to try to avoid talking about those high-profile cases. But on the whole, the nature of the unlawful behavior is on the milder end of the spectrum. So in terms of vulnerability to extremism specifically now, and coming back to what we know about the population at large, and specifically that comorbidity with other mental health problems may be relevant or important, it makes sense to look at the rates of comorbidity in autism. And again, here's another, and I apologize, another busy slide, but I've referenced this here so that you can go away and look at this at your leisure. But this is probably one of the better systematic reviews and meta-analyses of autism and prevalence of comorbidity. I won't go into this in any detail, but each row represents a particular mental disorder, and the fourth column there describes the pooled prevalence. And what you'll see, if you compare that figure to the figure in the sixth column, which is the general population prevalence, is that across all disorders, the prevalence of comorbidity is much higher in autism than in the population at large. The caveat here is that the heterogeneity between studies is very large, and this will again be due to the methodological variation between the studies in terms of the target population chosen, or the method of assessment, or even the diagnostic criteria used. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that these results show that the rates of, for example, anxiety and depression are much higher among autistic individuals than the population at large. And as I've said already, these may be relevant risk factors to engagement with extremist groups. We don't know, but it kind of makes sense. For example, if someone has chronic low mood and that develops into a depression, and then there's a background of feeling anxious and for perhaps not going out, you can imagine how that person might eventually engage with online communities. I think there are other factors. These are not tried and tested factors. These are not factors that have been evidenced from the literature, but I think these are factors that are not only apparent in relation to the general forensic literature, so that 30 years of forensic literature that I talked about. So these are factors that have come up there, but I think also in those cases that we know of, where autistic people have engaged in extremist acts of violence. And I don't think there's anything terribly surprising on this list. So if the person is isolated, perhaps socially excluded, they might be feeling lonely. They might be searching for a sense of belonging, and also a sense of kind of status and purpose in life. And they may have previously been a victim of bullying, and they may be jealous of certain other people and consequently feel hopeless about their own situation. And you can imagine how this can spiral into negative cognitions, engagement with what they see as being supportive others, or a search for some level of understanding offered by other groups. And one of those groups I'll talk about in a few moments is the incel group. There's also the possibility of vulnerability at the cognitive level. So we know that some autistic people have fixed, firmly held beliefs and a strong sense of what's right and wrong. And the literature, again, the forensic literature in particular, has described situations where this has been related to subsequent unlawful behavior. We know that autistic people have areas of interest, and these are sometimes pursued with quite certainly pursued to the extent that other activities are neglected. So the intensity is really quite large. We also know from some of the neuropsychological literature that autistic people have socio-emotional vulnerability, such as poor empathy and theory of mind, so the ability to reflect on other people and their motivations and behavior. So you can imagine how some of these vulnerabilities, particularly when associated with those other vulnerabilities that I mentioned a few moments ago, you can imagine how these might all come together and increase a person's risk. The involuntary celibate group is of particular relevance because there have been a number of high-profile cases of autistic individuals who have identified with the incel group and who have gone on to commit acts of mass violence. So for those of you who aren't aware of incels, I just thought I'd provide a bit of background here. The idea originated, I can't remember how many years ago, but originated as an online forum that focused on vocalizing frustration about an inability to find romantic connections. And it evolved fairly quickly into this magnet for angry males to express hostility to others. And the hostility was particularly directed at certain females, that they have their own terminology, and females that they term Stacys and Beckys, and alpha males that they term Chads. And this was a forum that grew very quickly and was originally given voice through certain online forums such as Reddit, but has since moved to platforms such as 4chan and Discord, where the misogynistic and misanthropic rants are essentially the norm of what's included there. I have visited one of these forums out of curiosity, and it's really quite disturbing. They have their own terminology, as I've mentioned, and the norm is the red pill, which is the identification itself. But there's also this slipping towards an espousal of violence to achieve goals, which they term the black pill. And when they use the terminology go ER, they're essentially encouraging someone to go and commit a violent act. And you see people type that on the forum. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that anyone goes to visit these, even out of curiosity. Now, basically, a manifest as a result of this kind of, I guess, huge amount of, or the large number of individuals contributing to these platforms, as well as particular key individuals, ER being one of them, a manifesto has emerged. And this manifesto essentially indicates the need for any of those people embracing this label of incel to take control of their lives and exact revenge, essentially, for the way that they've been treated. What is really quite striking, though, is when this group of researchers looked at incel affiliation in terms of the characteristics of those that identify with the label of incel, what they found was that 24.6% of respondents to their survey, and that was 272 respondents, described symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. Well, whether they were autistic, we don't have that information, but what's important, I think, is that nearly a quarter of individuals identified as being autistic. There were also a number of other factors that we know is unfortunately the experience of people with autism as they're growing up, such as bullying, and 87% described being bullied. 80% described having been shy at school, and more than a quarter described having no friends throughout middle and high school. So in terms of assessment then, there's clearly a risk. There's clearly vulnerability that even though we may not have scientific data to support what the exact risk factors are, there's clearly a number of factors that we as clinicians and professionals that work with autistic people know characterize the experience and the lived experience of those autistic people. And I think in terms of the assessment based upon that knowledge, there are a number of things we need to consider. First of all, that is the identification of those at risk and the provision of support. There's also the need to assess motivation. So I think on the one hand, having extremist beliefs does not necessarily spiral into violence. We have no data on that, but there may well be a lot of individuals who never have any intention of acting out on their extremist beliefs. There's also the need to look at group affiliation. Now, the data support the fact that group affiliation in terms of being recruited into particular terrorist organizations is not common in this group. But in terms of, you imagine the number of hours someone might spend online and the easy availability of people who are angry and who are willing to direct them to particular organizations, you can imagine how it's not recruitment, but how on one level it is recruitment might occur so easily. There's also the need, though, to consider wider vulnerability traits. And at the bottom there, I talk about red herrings. Because someone has autism and because they're angry and lonely and they go on to incel chats, doesn't mean that that is the main vulnerability. There may be other factors in their life, in particular, I suppose, lack of support, but there may be other mental health problems that are relevant when considering vulnerability, because, of course, when considering treatment, all of these various factors need to be addressed. What's also important is what I've called here significant others, the need for support networks and the need to identify those support networks. And identifying them is not good enough. There needs to be an assessment of significant others. There's actually, very interestingly, a significant others scale. And this scale not only identifies who those others are, but also, identifies who those others are, but identifies it from the perspective of those others and the perspective of the autistic individuals themselves. So an autistic individual may identify another person as a significant other, but that other person may not see themselves as being a significant other for that autistic person. And equally, there may be people that autistic person would not identify as a significant other who themselves believe that they are relevant in that person's life. I hope that makes some sense. There's obviously a need for a formal psychiatric assessment, and that relates to the need to consider all possible psychiatric diagnoses, but also the need to consider personality vulnerabilities. There needs to be a formal assessment of cognition to identify not only risk factors, but also protective factors. I've talked about such things as the difficulty seeing things from another person's point of view and then jumping to conclusions as a consequence, or not being able to read other people. But actually, there's quite a significant variation across autistic people in that skill. And if you have a person that's particularly good at that, that can be useful scaffolding to encourage the development of positive relationships. And we need to avoid diagnostic reductionism. It's very, and we do it a lot, and I'm probably guilty of this as well, is that what we tend to do nowadays is multiple diagnoses. We say this person has autism, ADHD, they also have a generalized anxiety disorder. But I think those diagnostic labels simplify something that is really quite complex. And if we just focus on labels, we miss that complexity. So there is another way to look at a person other than diagnostically, and that is their level of functioning, and that is their support networks and so forth. And I think that is just as, if not more, useful than the diagnostic labels that we use. I think it's also important to differentiate ASD from non-ASD. And as the spectrum grows wider, it's important to be able to differentiate where the margins of that spectrum sit. It's not easy, and certainly the diagnostic tools that we have available to us that very much think, particularly the screening questionnaires that very much think along the lines of quantitative traits. So where you then cut off autistic from non-autistic becomes really quite problematic. There are other disorders that look like autism, certain personality disorders that don't necessarily get commonly diagnosed nowadays, but such as schizoid personality, for example, that are nonetheless, from a nosological point of view, distinct from autistic disorder. And of course, something I haven't talked about, it's a big topic and time doesn't permit me to go into this in detail, but what I haven't talked about is childhood trauma and the relevance of trauma to some of the difficulties that we've been talking about today. In terms of management, this is obviously tricky and based upon availability of services and support and so forth, but clearly there's a need to identify and support those in society, generally speaking, who are vulnerable, but we know that a lot of people, autistic people, are vulnerable. And historically, there's been the provision of social groups and positive peer networks, the availability of structured activities to pull the person away from the computer, for example, and the availability of counseling and therapy. What we often find in this country is that counseling and therapy is time limited, and time limited is based upon what is available from budgeting terms. But actually, counseling and therapy often needs to go on for a long time. It provides something more than helping that individual understand themselves so they can overcome some of their vulnerabilities. It actually becomes part of their support network. So when you take it away, you're taking away part of their support network, and that can be quite problematic, particularly if you do it soon and too soon. There needs to be a multidisciplinary group of professionals involved, and they need to have the appropriate training. Autism has historically been a diagnosis associated with child psychiatry, for example, or pediatrics, or child neurology, or psychologists that work with children, and other health and social care professionals that work with children. But of course, autism is a lifelong diagnosis, and some people get the diagnosis in adulthood. And people that support people with autism, whether they're supporting children or adults, need to have knowledge about how to manage and how to approach and how to work with autistic people. There needs to be a focus on wider risk factors and not just autism. And this really goes back to that idea of the red herring. It's very easy to jump on something and say this happened because this person had this diagnosis. But I think that diagnostic reductionism really runs the risk of missing the point. I just have a few more slides and then I can take some questions. I just think there are other points that we need to think about. We focus very much on the individual, the risk, the assessment, and the management of that risk. But in terms of the wider criminal justice process, people, I think generally speaking, find the criminal justice process quite complicated, quite anxiety provoking. And I think that's very true of autistic people as well. And so a limited understanding of caution and legal rights and difficulty understanding the court proceedings has been written about in detail. as well as methods to overcome that. And my understanding is, in this country at least, but also in the US and Canada, there have been moves to introduce different different approaches to overcome some of these vulnerabilities. And I think these are sometimes very successful. There's also the issue of suggestibility and acquiescence and compliance during the police interview, and how these may impact on the conclusions drawn about someone's behavior. Now, there's no evidence that people with autism are more suggestible than non-autistic people, but certainly there is evidence that autistic people may be vulnerable to be acquiescent during police interviews and interrogations. And that's important to consider, not necessarily from our point of view, but we need to share that information with those who are doing the interrogation and the criminal justice system more generally. Other specific issues that I won't cover, but again, this really just touches the surface on how big a topic this is. The idea of fitness to plead, the idea of fitness to stand trial, and the idea of criminal responsibility. And the idea of criminal responsibility did come up in the Manassian trial. I said I wasn't going to mention names, and I just did, but the Toronto van attack trial, the issue of criminal responsibility did come up in that trial. So future directions for research. Clearly, we have some data and the methodology is somewhat limited. So there needs to be community-based studies. Diagnostic measures need to be robust, and data need to be collected beyond mere diagnosis to include other factors such as psychological vulnerabilities and childhood traumas. Studies need to be big to ensure that they have the power to test a particular hypothesis and not leave that hypothesis open to further discussion. And the only way to achieve that is through multi-center research. And I think more and more, certainly in pharmaceutical trials, multi-center research has become the norm, but not necessarily in forensic studies. It's important to involve autistic people and their families in research. And I'm part of a group that meets to talk about vulnerability to extremism that has representation from autistic people. And obviously any research needs focus groups to identify what the priorities are. We're talking about a broad area here of forensic risk and risk of extremism and risk of mass violence. Within that, there may be areas that need to be the focus for the priority for research. And obviously the engagement with stakeholders who may be able to result in change as a result of this research is important at an early stage rather than waiting for the results to come out. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can see whether there are any questions.
Great talk, Mark.
Thank you.
Let's see, it looks like there's at least one. Do you see the
Okay,
chat?
I can see. Yeah, I can see there's a question. Given that much of adolescent social engagement is online and adolescence is often a time of heightened vulnerability and reduction in accessibility of services, how do you approach balancing risk reduction with the need to learn online socialization skills? Is there a role for media literacy? I mean, absolutely. It's such an important point that, you know, I'm of a generation that wasn't introduced to screens and doing activities online until a much later stage. But young people are now spending an increasing amount of time doing lots of different things, including engaging socially online. And I do think that relevant authorities, whether they be social care or education, are tuned into this fact and the need to make those environments safe, as well as us as parents. But that, yeah, I agree, that's absolutely an important point. It's very difficult, though, to balance risk reduction with the need to allow our young people to use those tools, because they are tools of the future. And I don't have the answer in terms of what needs to be done to ensure that it's done safely, other than the pragmatic approaches that we use currently.
Mark, if I could ask a question, and people should feel free if they have other questions, please put them in the chat. One of the things I've had a little bit of experience with here, not so much recently, but a little more in the past, was as a result of bombings or terrorist acts, people with ASD would go online to get information, basically to manage their anxiety, if you can follow that.
Yeah.
And because they were online so much, looking up, how do you construct a bomb? How do you do all this stuff? All of a sudden, the government comes knocking on the door to say, what's up here? That's gone down a little bit, but this question of anxiety management and sort of getting pulled into too much information on the web.
Yeah, it is a problem. It's certainly a potential problem, and I've come across that too. What I like to think is that we are able to diagnose autism at a young enough age that we can identify not only the fact that the person has autism, but what their particular vulnerabilities are, such that those vulnerabilities can be identified sooner rather than later. And we know from working with autistic children that some of them are extremely anxious, but also very tech savvy, such that they can overcome their anxiety by going online. But if they have an IEP and what we call an education healthcare plan that identifies those behaviors, then I would like to think, and maybe I'm living in an ideal world that's not a real world here, but I would like to think that those teachers, health professionals, family, and so forth, and peers that know that person would be able to pick up on that, such that, and you wouldn't stop the person doing that. If that's their way of dealing with their anxiety, then it's harmless. If information gathering is harmless. But where you would intervene is the involvement of the criminal justice system. And I think there are other examples of people that we've seen that have areas of special interest that might theoretically bring them into contact with the criminal justice system, but because we know that person, we know that's never, they're never going to cross that line. Right. And I think we need to be able to share that with relevant authorities, such that they don't have the criminal justice system and police knocking on their door.
And as you say, that it is critically important for the police to understand that folks with autism are usually quite nice and compliant, and you say anything to them and they'll say yes, yes, yes. And that people have to understand that you have to take a step back and think a little bit about how you word your questions and how you approach the person with autism. It's a bit of a challenge.
It is, yeah. And it's very easy to get it wrong as well, I think. It's very easy. You imagine the criminal justice system that doesn't know an autistic person jumping to conclusions and believing that they're arrogant or dismissive, when actually they're just anxious and they don't have the skills to interact. So I think it's important, not to jump to conclusions, which we don't do, but I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, and it's sort of straightforward enough in some ways for them to think about just that. Are there any other questions? Somebody's asking who can see the messages. I think, I don't know if everybody can see the messages. Eileen may know.
If the messages are sent to everyone, then everyone can see the messages. If you're sending a message directly to one person, only that person can see the messages.
There you go. So if you have
I can see one message to everyone, and that's it so far.
Yes.
Okay. Here it comes.
Oh, there's another one. Brad, I don't know if you can answer that one.
The NYU Child Study Center had some interest in this, and the other thing would be the Child Mind Institute. there is a big autism parent group in New York City, and they might have some leads on this. And there are a couple of attorneys based in New York who really specialize in autism, ASD. And if you were to email me, I could tell you the names of some of the attorneys. It's a pretty specialized area, as you can imagine. The whole business of educating police, court, judges. If anybody is interested, we have a series of online talks on autism and the law that I think Mark's part of, I'm part of, and you can come and take a look. But there's a lot of good information out there, not as much as there should be, and there needs to be a lot more in terms of first responder and police education. First responders and police are not exactly the same thing, it turns out. And all of a sudden we're getting more. So intervention services for adolescents. That's a complicated question. I'd have to have you email me offline, and I can do that. Mark, do you see the question from the regional?
Yes, there's one from Gary. Any references regarding association with childhood trauma? No, and there aren't any references. And I find that childhood trauma is often neglected in this area of research, presumably because it's so difficult to measure. A lot of the research on autistic adolescents and adulthoods, and in terms of forensic involvement, tend to focus on assessments of the here and now with information gathered from background, but actually trying to collect information on childhood trauma reliably, I think is very, very difficult to do and requires a prospective approach, or at least an approach where you collect that information as near as possible to when it happens. Otherwise, it becomes increasingly unreliable. Yeah. It's really important, though, and I just don't think the information's out there.
Yeah, I think case reports, anecdote, but otherwise not systematic research, sadly. This is an area where there's not so much, as you point out, in the way of really solid systematic research. Are there other questions? There's
another one here. Hi, Mark. I'm a regional school safety coordinator, and this information is very helpful. My crisis team is made up of mental health professionals, and this information would be very helpful to share with them. That's good. And I hope that my slides have some references and you manage to find those references. If you have any problems getting the references in terms of, I don't think they're all open access, for example, I'm happy for you to contact me and I can get you those references. They're not, like I say, they're not great, but I think that's all there is. And at least the authors of those papers have consistently raised the methodological limitations. They're not naive to that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Any other questions?
I just want to interject. We are recording this presentation. It will be going up on our website, most likely later next week, along with Mark's slides. So for those that were unable to attend or know people that would benefit, please direct them to our website.
Great. Mark, thank you very much. This was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Next month we have, I believe it's Dr. Nancy Moss doing an overview of social skills training in autism, and we look forward to seeing people then. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Fred.
See you next month. Mark, thanks. This was great.
Thanks very
so much,
much.
Mark.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.